Well, sir, time is a funny thing. I ever tell you about the time that old Bill Tattersall found his way on the wrong side of a ditch? It was the summer of '72. The sun was hot, beating down the beds and bare bellies of the sons and daughters out in the field that day. It was looking like a rough harvest. Corn hadn't been picked in God knows how long. The plows weren't holding up as long as we liked. There was a young boy there by the name of Jacob. His brother, Michael, was born without toes on his left foot and with one too many on his right, which gave him thereabouts somewhat of a limp. Well, be damned if that young boy didn't make that his own iconic brand, as it were. He used to limp around, jumping up and down, making sure he was getting what he needed. He was a con man before he knew what a con man was. He'd sell playing cards to the kids down the road for a dime a pop, telling them they'd come from Las Vegas or somewhere as such. We always knew Michael was destined for greatness. His brother Jacob, as I mentioned earlier, well, he was always into painting himself, making colors from the old sand and dirt that he found laying about the house, mixing it with his papa's moonshine, or even just some quick creek water gathered down by the little stream out back some of our property back there. We were never sure exactly what we were going to do when the day began, and we were chased out of the home with the broom or rake or some implement or ornament that our parents used to get us down and out. But nonetheless, we managed to find ourselves adventuring on, as it were. Anyway, there were about 4 of us, a little gang, as we used to like to think of ourselves, a little mischievous pack of runts, running around town, popping firecrackers in the letterboxes and stealing shoes, tying them together off the porch and throwing them over the power lines. That sort of general riffraff that young children get up to when unaccompanied by an adult or a chaperone. So one day we decided to get on our push bikes and push ourselves all the way out to the edge of the zoning sector. You see, there are these concrete barricades put in place by the government a couple years prior, before the Battle of Eugene broke out, where we were able to make safe passage through them without too much unrest and unease. There was a slight tingling in the air that none of us quite had a word for yet. We came to know that tingling as the burn. That didn't get us till much later. Nonetheless, we found our way down south, as I said, beyond the barricades one day. There was a steep canyon that would lead us down to the old salt mines. We were, of course, told as children never to go in there, for the dangers were getting lost and never quite making our way back out, or tripping and falling and breaking a bone and being unable to find the approved and needed help at the time and in time to seek medical assistance for the malady that the fall or break may have caused. Nonetheless, we decided that day to go down into the salt mines, for there were rumors of many strange animals that had been rising up from the heated need for the concrete barriers at the time. 3-winged bats, a coyote that only had one eye, birds that made strange sounds, strange enough to haunt your dreams. There was an old timer back in that neighborhood at the end of the street. O'Driscoll was his name. He used to talk about dreams, the birds in his dreams, calling, talking to him. Birds and parrots and such have an uncanny ability to replicate the sound of a human voice with high fidelity accuracy, and well, it spooked old O'Driscoll. And he used to tell us just about every night he'd have some sort of night tormenting terror that would wake him up in a cold sweat. The birds chanting out his name down in the very salt mines we were about to explore in our adolescent naivety. O'Driscoll, that sorry son of a bitch, I'll tell you. He was always getting up to no good, causing havoc down at the bank or real estate office or cartographer. He used to know how to stir trouble. He'd stand outside and scream and scream and scream as if he were reliving some ancient accident not happening to him but to his ancestors or their ancestors, something that would rake your bones through the aeons of time. And he would do that until he was carried away, often beaten first into subdued submission. He was always kind to the neighborhood kids, but no one ever much cared for old O'Driscoll. He lived in a shack that his wife owned before she passed, and her will must have passed it on to him. No income and expenses. He used to just make his way around town. We used to call him a hobo with a home. He was aware of it. He was aware of both his good and bad fortune that had come his way. He told us of the salt mines. In fact, if truth be told, it was probably up to him. He would have come down back into them old salt mines with us, finally get some closure on the experience that caused him so much grief and havoc at the time. He told us, boys, deep down, heading north, following the faint trickle of air that you'll eventually feel when the air becomes so still you'll think you'll suffocate. There's always a passage, always a breeze coming through. Follow that passage for about 8 minutes, 9 minutes, or as long as it takes for you to get as scared out of your mind as you possibly can. Follow it down. Whatever path takes you down toward the center of the earth, you go down it. It's a not very steep decline, but it's persistent, and it happens mostly in a straight line, a corridor of nothing but depth. The walls carved away in perfect right angles. You'd think that a large box had just been pushed by a gigantic force, 100 meters, 200, 3 or 4, maybe even a kilometer through and down into the ground, eventually like a long syringe piercing the eye of the core of the planet. Follow that down. I didn't know this at the time, said O'Driscoll, but the track actually curved round in a large spiral, a vortex, if you will. This was not common practice for a salt mine in those days, or a mine of any kind, in fact, and it became evident that the path he was trudging down itself was older than the mine, and that the salt in the mine was but a ruse for digging for something else. Eventually, the deeper he went, the more things he found. Bones, teeth, tattered remnants of cloth, leather, sometimes skin, but not very often. What could have been old fragments of blood and broken sticks and stones used as weapons, or maybe on oneself to relieve oneself of an insanity that was never coming, and yet would never arrive, but never leave at the same time. O'Driscoll believed he was the first, if not the only, human soul ever to leave that salt mine, and he was never the same again after. He'd ventured into it in his early 30s, double the age of us boys back then listening to his tall tale. He went further down and down. And when he was telling us this story, he said, the further down I went, the more it was that like time stopped. Or maybe not stopped, but stretched out. Like I was walking in some temporal goo or ooze, designed to make the walk feel tedious, each step taking 1,000 years. There was a force in there. Something was alive. Something was telling me not to keep going and was trying to use time to scare me away. But for whatever reason, dumb luck, youthful bravado, old O'Driscoll kept on traveling down, pushing through, getting past the fearsome bones and three-winged bats and one-eyed coyotes. It should be said here, this was not a coyote with a missing eye. This was a mammalian canine that had grown to be with one singular eye, staring up blankly, not forward, like it was meant to be that way, designed solely for one purpose. These were the wild ramblings of O'Driscoll, Maine, as it were. And we boys used to lap it up, sitting on his porch, listening to him talk, wax lyrical about the depths of the salt mines. Of course, he had another name for 'em. Was it something like Doreen? Orel? Skips the mind currently. Anyway, Driscoll said that he left every ounce and inkling of his sanity in that there mine, and he put another 60 years on top of the mid-30s that he had when he was in it. We never believed that he'd managed to live a good 60 years as someone certifiably insane, but the longer you got to talking to the man, the more you started to question your own ideas about what insanity actually is, what it's made of. Of course, at the time, I was never too concerned myself with the quality of insanity, of what it actually meant to be insane. I was more concerned with firecrackers, dating my classmates, fixing my bike, stopping people from buying Michael's forged playing cards that he told people were from Las Vegas. Really. They were just from the dollar store, and he used to draw on the back of them to make them look all special. Forged signatures of the famous baseball players and whatnot to convince people he was selling on memorabilia. First counterfeiter I ever met had a nub foot. His name was Michael Rawlins. Hell of a character. O'Driscoll never managed to enlighten us exactly as to what he found when he got to what he so-called the bottom of the mine. He believed it was A cave naturally made by geological forces over countless aeons and years, potentially water leaking through calcified deposits, making them weak and eroding away space to allow for a vorticide channel. Some point in human history, hands had come along. Mankind had come on in and carved it out for itself, making these channels large enough, wide enough, and square enough not only to walk through with full feet at 6 foot, but to marvel at the engineering precision and sheer depth of practice that this must have taken. It was a mine, it was a maze. Couldn't quite call it a labyrinth other than to say that the way you got lost in it was not knowing how long you'd been in there for, and having no gauge for how long it would take to get back out. At least if you're lost in the desert, you can see the sun rise and fall. In those caves, time started stretching out. You couldn't pin yourself to anything stable. You could be so far in that there was not enough time for you to walk back out. Even if you could eat, shit, and breathe and drink for the next 40 years. There's something about going deep down into that mine that made you forget. Made you forget who you were, why you were there, what the goddamn Sam hell you were doing it for in the first place, and make you convinced you were born there. I'm getting ahead of myself, I do admit. Old Driscoll was telling us about his time in the mine. We were fascinated as kids. We'd take these stories back to our parents who would tell us never to concern ourselves with anything outside the barricades there. There was bad air outside them barricades, and we weren't to interfere with it, no matter how much we wanted to, for it would mean that we may not be allowed back into the commune of the day. The patrols might deem us unclean. Of course, all this talk about restrictions and out of bounds and places we weren't allowed to go or weren't allowed to engage with or see made us ever more curious to go on down inside and check it out for ourselves. And of course, during the day were the powers that be, authorities, parents, chaperones, and such, especially during the great drought of '73, as I mentioned earlier. They didn't want us bothering them, and they were happy for us to disappear for hours at a time, so we thought, why the hell not? We all wanted to see a one-eyed coyote or a three-winged bat. We had no idea what to expect, and we knew if we wanted, we could always walk back out whenever we liked. And we took a few measures in place. We took our watches, and we took a stopwatch and a gas light, and some torches with us so we could see. We took snacks and provisions. Hell, it could be said we had been planning this for a good couple of weeks. We didn't want to take any chances and tried to take heed of what old Driscoll said to us. Never be too sure what was lies and what was just straight out insanity. The very fact that the man lived to be in his mid-90s was a testament to his story. If my memory serves me correctly, at that time there were only a handful of people who had ever been born within the last 50 years that had ever made it to 90. At least that I'd heard about anyway. Most of them getting sick at 50 or 60. So, of course, with the danger and the promise of mutated animals, dogs and bats, the authorities telling us not to go in, and the freedom to do as we pleased. Of course, as young, adolescent, hot-blooded young individuals, we had to make our way down into that mine, find out what was going on for ourselves, and then make the executive decision to stay the hell away from it. At least it might make a good story. Never did I think I'd be sitting here, so many years later, telling this story. So, we made our way out of the barriers. Now, it was a good 2-hour bike ride to the salt mines. They were always sitting somewhere distant from the rest of things. It need be said here that salt mines themselves are something that no one ever really told us what they were for. I mean, it sounds evident in the title, does it not, that a salt mine is something that that your mind's salt from. This is not the case, not at all. Not in the easiest little bit. A salt mine is something that, well, it escapes reason. What we saw down there, it can't be described. It can't be told. It can't be understood. We've been led to believe they were mining for salt. Salt was crucial as a mineral used in many electronic devices and used for modern day-to-day living and so on and such, factories and whatnot. When we got out there, we didn't see no salt mines. We saw large black boxes. Box ain't quite the right term for it, for when someone says box, what they mean is something square, something that holds something. These were stones. These were gigantic rocks carved with exact laser point precision. Be as big as a goddamn semi-trailer sitting on the ground doing nothing. They were hollow in a sense, but a box as big as a semi-trailer when we found a way to climb up on top of one by making our way up the gorge and looking over the peak. We could see there was a hole in the top of it. It was about as big as a shoebox. In this large quarry that they called the salt mine, there were about 16 of these large semi-trailer sized stone bricks, I guess. When we got close to them, that's when we started to hear the buzzing. The buzzing and the humming. The closer we got to that hole in the top of that there brick, the louder the humming got. When we were within about 18 feet, it got too deafening to be able to comprehend any such longer, and we gave up. Getting down was its own effort in some ways. Nonetheless, we gave those boxes a big wide berth. Imagine, if you will, there was a small single-lane dirt road that led away from the highway, past the concrete barricades, through a tree line of Araucaria pine, down, and it curled around this single road, opening up onto this large limestone quarry, completely encircled by 30-foot high walls of waterlogged limestone. The quarry itself is about as big as maybe one and a half football fields, so quite large in its sized area. Nonetheless, scattered around were these large box squares. Now, if you were looking for the entrance to a mine, what might you expect to find? You might expect to find, well, something that resembled an entrance, a large stone opening, or some sort of track with a cart on it that you might push and pull with your hands to be able to gain access. Who can tell? Who can say? It's hard to know. This didn't have any of that. The opening was a 4-foot square hole in the ground. That was it. There was a rope ladder nearby, heaped into a pile, about 8 feet from the opening. There were 2 pickets nailed into the top of the ground there, and 2 eyelets on the rope that could be hung on the pickets. We, being the smart young boys we were, decided to make 2 and 2 of what we were looking at, hang the eyelets of the ropes on the pickets themselves. The entrance to the mine was a hole in the ground. Again, perfectly square. It wasn't a cylindrical hole. It wasn't bored out with some sort of gigantic drill. It was a square hole, carved with precision. It was perfect right angles all around. Limestone, I don't know if you know, it's soft, crumbly, somewhat like chalk, but wetter. Susceptible to erosion, which is what told us this was new, somewhat. Anyway, the rope ladder toppled down into the hole itself, and, well, it must have spent a good 10 seconds unraveling. That's when we realized that the salt mines were not mines at all. They were something else. One long, vorticed, spiraling tunnel, heading down into the depths of the center of the earth. Nonetheless, we'd been traveling for a good hour and a half to get here, and we sure as hell weren't going to give up just because it was a long way down. The ladder itself looked sturdy. The pikes themselves looked at no risk of letting up, and we made sure that young Jacob himself would stick up top and make sure nothing happened. If anything was going to happen, he was going to throw down one of the torches to give us a fair warning and come back up. Anyways, so we did it. Me, Michael, and a young lady by the name of Elaine Donahue. We all decided to descend down into the salt mines together, deciding that old Driscoll's insanity was related to the fact that he wandered the mines alone, and that, well, the 3 of us, we might be able to maintain some grip on objective reality at the time. We descended for a long time, a lot longer than we realized we should have. So there we were, me, Michael, and Elaine, climbing down this ladder, laughing, unsure of ourselves. We had little headlights on our head and torches in our back pocket. We had some matches and petrol too if we needed to make a more analog edition, but the battery in the headlights was just fine for now. We felt no fear descending. And so, after a long climb down, must have been a good 20 minutes of straight descent. Couldn't tell you how long it lasted, how long a drop it actually was, but we eventually made it on the ground. We were standing on hard rock, no longer limestone, smooth, smooth as polished and carved marble, black, obsidian black, and polished to a shine that was whisker away from perfect reflection. We could see ourselves in the walls of that rock there. Again, a perfectly square opening, about 6 feet by 6 feet. Us all being just over 5 foot, laying a little under. Had no trouble standing up in this. I guess you'd call it a tunnel. So we started to make our way down into the depths. I was first, Elaine trailing behind, and Michael behind him with his characteristic and well-branded limp. We walked on and reminiscing on the stories old Driscoll was telling us about where we were and marveling at the fact that we finally had gotten there. We didn't hear anything or see anything out of suspicion. It was just a dark tunnel, darkness in front of us, darkness behind. Although I will reflect on a curious phenomenon that we had both noticed. If we turned around and headed back toward the ladder, we could hear our voices echo. Voice and sound would travel back down, back up the tunnel toward ground height, and would come back to us in characteristic form. And yet, if we turned around and started to descend, no such echo could be identified. It was as if the sound did not reverberate off any of the stone when it was descending, only when it was ascending. It should be said, at the place where the ladders came out of the roof and led us into the tunnel, it did ascend in a spiral back up. We let Michael trace it for a few minutes before he said there was a cave-in. Something had blocked off the mine, and that the hole that had been carved for us to climb down through, may have been a more recent addition to the tunnel itself. Nonetheless, we made our way down, and as O'Driscoll had told us, it was as if we were traveling in a straight line, no perceptible curve at all. Just a very slightly sloping ramp going down and down. And the air was cool, but it was fresh, and we could feel a very faint breeze on our skin. Me, leading the charge, felt it most strongly. There was some source of fresh air coming from the very base and bottom of that tunnel. From here on in, it gets somewhat difficult to describe exactly what happened and in what order it happened in. We had hoped to find a mutated bat or some strange cycloptic coyote, but when we did find them, they meant very little to us. As we went down further, we started to notice artifacts and items and objects littering the corners of the walls. In some places there were recesses carved in, small holes, and places that one might place a candle or a light. Some of these, or most of them, were empty. Some of them contained strange items untouched. The memory, of course, gets faded here, but I do remember seeing a human skull. I do remember hearing the howling of the wolf, or maybe it was that coyote we'd been looking for. Along the ways there were some rough carvings made into the stone. Something like hieroglyphs or simplified iconic symbols. Hard to tell. Then the bones started coming. It was quite alarming, for we were walking for what felt like miles. Many miles, hours perhaps passed. We walked down and around, and all of a sudden, bam, there were a pile of bones. Looked like could have been human, could have been feline, canine, could have been bird bones. They were just bones, you name it, all different sizes and shapes. There was a pathway still carved through them, but there was no doubt about it. Hundreds, if not thousands, of poor creatures had made their ends in these tunnels here. And these were old bones. These were picked clean by the ravages of time. There was no smell. There was no decay. There was no sign of any other remain than just the bones, yellowed in age and oldness. So we kept on trudging down, and funnily enough, the bones thinned out. And we started to realize that we had walked through something of an area. We called it the boneyard, and it was one of the more haunting places to get through. We never asked ourselves too many questions about that area of the tunnel, or the questions themselves opened up even more questions and quandaries to somehow comprehend. How did they get down there? Who did they belong to? Why were there so many, and why were they all in that one 20-minute area? We had realized after some time to count the distance, not in a rough estimation of distance, but in of time. When we cleared our way past the boneyard, we opened ourselves up. That is, we started talking more, for as we were traipsing through the bones and scattered remnants of lives once lost, we were silent. We couldn't bear to talk. In fact, none of us exactly knew how to describe exactly what we were seeing. We were innocent kids. We'd never seen much trouble, never been around death in any strong sense other than the odd grandparent or town elder dying here or there. Come to think of it, reflecting back, that was the first time I'd ever truly contemplated not only death, but my own. Naive. So we made our way through the bones, and funnily enough, almost exactly where the bone yard ended, the tunnel itself opened out. Now, it wasn't by much, it was only by a little tiny stretch. Okay, the width and the height of this tunnel may have been, like I said, 6 foot by 6 foot, but it widened itself out in a very gradual taper to be maybe 7 by 7 foot. We didn't notice this at first. We were just walking along and started to notice that the ceiling was a little taller than what it was a minute or two ago. So we started to think maybe we were on the right track. Maybe we were headed to the center. Now, we'd never stopped to really ask ourselves what we were looking for. We just heard the old tale that old Driscoll had told us and decided we want to see it for ourselves. What the hell? What the Sam hell? It'll be a great story. That's sometimes how some of the worst stories ever come out. So the tunnel widened. We've been walking now for what felt like a good 2.5 hours, so God knows how deep into the earth we were. We were neither hungry nor thirsty. We weren't necessarily tired, but the confusion was definitely settling in. And only in retrospect can I observe that I did not know what the hell was going on. I was being pulled forward by, well, my intuition at best. At the time, I remember thinking everything was all right. I could see, think, feel, and hear perfectly fine, but in retrospect, it was like I was under the influence and power of some strong narcotic. So, the tunnel opened out. We went deeper. I felt still the cool breeze coming from somewhere deep inside this spiral. And then it started getting strange. We decided we were starting to lose track of how far we walked and how long we'd been down there. It should be said our navigating equipment all but failed, of course. The stopwatches stopped working. Our clocks and watches and any device used to measure instances of time was failing us. Sometimes the stopwatch would measure a second, and sometimes it would jump forward 30 minutes, sometimes backwards, and never work all together, so we put those away and decided to try a simple experiment. We decided to count. This is where we came to understand something in this moment, in this experiment. It was a simple one. We decided to close our eyes and count to 10. Simple act. We'd all done it before. We did it with our eyes open first and out loud with each other. 1 to 10 in quick succession. Wasn't quite 10 seconds, wasn't quite 20 seconds. Lay somewhere in the middle. And then the instruction was to close our eyes and count to 10 inside our own minds, opening when we were done. So I closed my eyes and I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I started to feel it. 7, 8. Something strange. I started to become aware of something that was happening. 9. Time was slowing down. I was starting to feel uneasy. Scared. 10. I opened my eyes. What I saw haunted me and will continue to haunt me for the rest of my life. I didn't believe what I was looking at, so I looked down. My own hands. The fingernails on them had grown about this long. My toenails starting to push through my socks and my shoes. The hair on my head itself about an additional 6 inches long. I wasn't to find out this until days later, but my face was looking haggard and worn as if I'd stayed awake for 80 hours or something all at once. Michael was on the floor. Elaine, she was standing there with her mouth open, her eyes closed, still counting. I could tell, inside her own mind, stuck, trapped in some infinite clock. She was the worst. I do believe it was from being stuck in that tiny little space, in that rift in time. Had we done it sooner, she may have gotten out. She was old. She'd aged about 50 years. Her fingernails curled around like boa constrictors. Her hair touching and dusting the floor. Her skin ragged and leathered and pale. Her teeth some missing. Large sacks of purplish skin hanging underneath her eyes. I almost didn't want to wake her. Michael himself was starting to look a little bit more like a grown man at that time. It turns out I had weathered myself the best. Somehow I was saved the most. I'd only aged a few days, maybe a week at worst. Michael a few years, and poor Elaine at least 3 decades. Time was stretched and pulled inside that space. We reached out and we woke Elaine up. We shook her, and as she shook, she exclaimed, "Dan!" In her mind, she'd been gone only less than 10 seconds. It's hard to describe the sound she made when she looked down at her own aged and wrinkled hands, a body that had been lost in the aeons of time without, well, time having passed, one could say. We weren't hungry, we weren't tired, we didn't need drink or no water, but time had affected us in some way. And I'll tell you, having come up eventually back to the surface, I'm still trying to account for those couple of days, and that I'm always feeling as if I'm a couple of days behind in some way, somehow, some shape or form. I lost them, and I ain't never getting them back. So we decided at that point in time, after calming Elaine down and letting her room to breathe, without thinking too much on it at the same time, we should make our way back. What lies ahead is probably nothing but death, and if we wanted to end up like those forgotten bones in the boneyard before, and we should make haste and hightail it out of there. Now, of course, the strange phenomenon, occurrences that were occurring at the time did not stop with our eyes closed or open, and the boneyard started to become something of a little bit more of a logical stepping stone before we went into the deeper depths of the tunnel itself. The creatures and animals that found themselves in that space did not fight to be there. We saw it in the lane. Michael felt it too, and I felt it the least, but that was when we started to feel tired. We had energy and adrenaline from the scare we got back in the opening, but this tired came over us like sleep on a Christmas morning, cold and dense, freezing us from within, making it almost impossible to climb in any way. And that was when it became apparent. The descent was simple. It was easy to walk down toward the cool breeze of a timeless space, the dark obsidian walls reflecting our lights and making us eager to explore. The ascension, the feeling of quitting, of giving up, of losing that treasure that we were looking for, that next moment, that something or other that we didn't know what we were chasing for, behind us. The echoing that would come out on the ascent, almost deafening our ears because it was silent on the way down without any echo. And the boneyard became a place of slumber. It became all too enticing to lay our heads down and take a small rest. We knew we couldn't close our eyes, not for an instant. I'm not sure about you, but if you've ever tried to keep your eyes open for longer than 2 minutes, it starts to get quite painful. We weren't game. Poor Elaine. She made her decision down in the tunnel. There was no fighting. There was no trying to convince her otherwise. I'd just goddamn seen her age 40 years in the space of 10 seconds. And none of us wanted to even try and comprehend how long time had actually passed in there. We didn't know if it would be worse or better, if there had been none at all. If we had moved out of the top of that hole only to find a few minutes had passed. Is that better? Or worse? Poor Elaine. She leant down. She found herself a quiet, nestled place, got herself comfortable, put her head on her hands, curled up beside her, and closed her eyes for the last time. We knew she wasn't counting this time, and we knew ain't nothing gonna wake her up again. We did it in our best to also keep our eyes open, keep 'em on her, for the fear that if we closed them and opened them again, she would be gone and nothing but a pile of bones to tell her tale. We said a goodbye with a solemn nod before turning back and making our way up the ascension. Now the hard part, the challenge. I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying and telling you that this ascension, well, it felt like it took a good 10 years or so. Now, I lived many 10 years in my life, This was the longest 10 years I ever lived, and I didn't know by the end of it if it was a good thing or bad thing that I was there with company. Had I been on my own, I could have convinced myself that it was just in my mind. Something else was happening, something different. But Michael and I, we talked. We talked and talked. We talked longer than anybody could have talked. We told more stories and tales and fables than anyone has ever told. We walked up for 10 years to get back to that ladder. We knew not to give up. Something inside was telling us that we would eventually get there, but we had to go through hell to do it. And that hell was nothing but a 6 foot by 6 foot, highly polished obsidian tunnel, carved by some ancient joker. Some fool who decided it would be fun to fold time in the bottom of the earth. We'd made our way in, and damned if we were going to make our way out. We'd gone in there, wanted some storytelling, wanting a good tale to tell. By God, did we get it. I lived over 50 years of my life, and I'm less than 31 years old. I've lived enough, told enough stories for 100, 1,000 people to tell back to back over and over again until their dying breath. And that was the last time and the first time I ever made my way into the salt mines on the edge of town. We ended up climbing up that rope ladder. Found Jacob sitting at the top, asleep now, and it was dark. We were right to guess that time was stretched in some way, and that when we would leave, not much time as had time passed for us would have passed for Jacob. To his markings, we were gone for a good 6 hours or so. He'd contemplated leaving and going to get help, but instead fell asleep, which is probably our saving grace. It took a while for him to recognize us, of course. We were different too. It was like waking from a dream. We hadn't aged as much as we thought, which we noticed as we were climbing back up the ladder. The only way to make heads or tails of the incident was to think that time moved forward as we went down and backwards as we went up, and disproportionately to how fast and how high we were traveling. What was at the bottom of that spiral, who could say? The tunnel could have gone on forever for all we knew. Could have taken us right back out to the point in which we started, and all we'd have is our memories and our experiences. And as for the difference in why I aged at a slower rate than Elaine and Michael, I can only say that could be related to how deep we were. I was deeper, and that the deeper you go, the more you are rewarded for how hard you travel. Of course, the deeper you go, the more you have to lose. And that is the story of the tunnel at the bottom of the salt mine.